in one of Dad's letters, he said he would never let what happened to me happen with the rest of the children. And so that was really like a warning, like, you got away and you did this, but no one else is going to.
Yeah. And that definitely proved to not be a hollow threat. And that's something that I can attest to personally in detail. That had teeth. That had weight. And he wielded that.
The World Tomorrow. The Worldwide Church of God presents Herbert W. Armstrong.
And there has been many, many false churches. Jesus said, I will build my church. He didn't say, I will build my churches. But there is a true church that is undeceived.
Well, the Lord gave me a revelation, a very important revelation.
Jesus Christ himself reveals it. It's not my revealing. It's not the revealing of Herbert W. Armstrong. It's the revealing of Jesus Christ. But this is the way he reveals it.
But I do see the demons when they're in someone, and they see me. I could talk about demons all day long right here. I can name demons by name. The devil has everybody out there. He already has them. He's not worried about them. He's concerned about you.
So the whole Thanksgiving thing happened with Dad. That was when he had the talks. I moved out. Kurt proposed to me at the beginning of February.
Okay.
And we actually had a wedding date set for June, I believe, of that year, which, just keep in mind, I literally just met him in August. And he doesn't even live in the same town. And I'm only seeing him not even every weekend. Because it took a couple of months to even get to that, where it was like most weekends. But I postponed the wedding just basically because I didn't feel ready. Everything just felt like it was happening so fast. And I had a lot of feelings of, I'm going to miss out on things at home and you guys, and I just wasn't ready to move 3 hours away. And so I postponed it. And this is a point that Dad would make. I know Dad made Mom feel guilty about, and you probably will remember this. Kurt was devastated that I postponed the wedding, and I remember sitting there on the couch in the living room at our house, and I was really just trying to think, what do I do? What do I do? What do I say to him? Like, he's been so supportive through all of this mess. And, I will point out those are not reasons. That's not a reason to marry someone. But there was part of me, of course, I cared about him, but there was this part of me that felt almost like I owe this to him. Like, he's been through so much with me already, and with such an incredible support. And I was sitting there on the couch thinking about it, and Mom walked in, and we started talking, and I told her how I was feeling, and I told her I don't know whether to set another date. I'm really not sure what to do. And Mom encouraged me to set another date. It wasn't that she said, set another date, or I think you should set another date, but it was more of what you would expect a mother to do, to support her child in a time of turmoil. And I was saying, I'm torn and I'm thinking about doing this. And I basically had her support in whatever decision I made, but she was in essence supportive of me rescheduling the wedding. And, I know that became a point of, shame for her later on, and that was something that was used against her, which I know that you experienced because of all of her testimonies that she had to give, telling the congregation of her great sin of supporting her daughter.
Yeah, and I'll just to kind of, I don't want to tell Mom's story for her,
Right.
but just for context on that point, because I've heard this testimony probably 100 times. I'm serious. Like Liz and I, my wife Liz and I talked about it, even in the time that she was there at the church. Like she couldn't count how many times she had heard it, and it seemed like it was more frequent at the end, and also that was more frequent by direction of Dad. It wasn't just Mom volunteering that she wanted to give this testimony, air quotes. But in general, I don't want to butcher her story, but in general, what it was is that after everything happened with you, Mom for years would start every single day with a prayer of asking God for forgiveness for what she had done. And when she was giving these testimonies, it was very nondescript. She never said what the great sin was. I couldn't even recall it, but I remembered it was something like that. It was something like, not a sin, just you didn't back Dad up on this thing. Some strain. It was typical.
Absolutely.
It was, par for the course for our raising. But she would start every day with this prayer, asking for forgiveness over and over. And at certain points, Mom was to the point of despair that she wanted to run away because she thought we would be better off without her. She thought that she was not redeemable, which is, a common thread, which we'll get into more. I think with multiple of, a lot of us children and other people in the church too. You'll probably hear more about that as we go. But she thought that perhaps she couldn't be saved, was beyond redemption, and that she would, we would be better off if she just left. And then at some point, I don't know how many years this was after this happened with you, but at some point she heard the voice of God tell her not to bring it up again. And that was the great testimony that she was called up to give, was how God had forgiven her and she was beaten down with guilt over this thing, which just to bring it back around, she was beat down with guilt about this thing because Dad told her to be.
He beat her down.
Yes. She didn't decide, I've sinned greatly by supporting my daughter in her marriage to another man in the faith. Like, it's so bizarre. But that's just kind of a recap of what Mom went through during that time period, which is, that's just one thing.
And I just recently heard that for the first time, that she had to give that testimony maybe, dozens of times. That lights a fire in me. That is hard to hear because that's some real psychological abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's
also
just reinforcement.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And to call her up there. So basically, she's got to walk up there and remember one of the worst times of her entire life, maybe the worst time of her life at that point, and recall that. It's unbelievable. It's totally unbelievable. The psychological damage that was incurred upon her. And it wasn't just that she supported me in resetting a wedding date, but she was supportive throughout the relationship. I do remember early on when Kurt came to visit that there were questions about whether he was converted or not, and he had not been baptized yet, which I've mentioned previously. And that was an issue. Neither Mom nor Dad liked that, but Mom liked him. I think Mom would say that she loved him. Kurt loved her. They had phone conversations on their own outside of me that I didn't even know about. Kurt thought she was one of the kindest, sweetest people he had ever met, which she is.
Mhm.
And so they did develop a positive relationship with one another, and Kurt did that as well with the rest of you. I mean, and we've talked about it. He taught you how to ride a bike.
Yeah.
And he took a real interest in all of you, actually, because he met Sarah and Jennifer at summer camp, and then met you and Michael subsequently when he came to visit, and we did things together as a family while he was there part of the time. And when I left after Dad's message, Mom continued contact with me. At that point, Dad didn't say, you can't have contact with Ashley, but he grew increasingly hostile towards me, towards the idea of me marrying Kurt, and then more hostile towards Mom. And I remember, I would just endure. I felt like I was enduring a beating when I would go to the house. And, maybe he would say, well, I did nothing to you, which I actually have that in letters where I've done nothing. Well, I can sense hostility. I mean, and I can tell when someone is icing me out and pretending that I don't exist, or, snapping at me, you don't live here anymore, because I pick up the telephone. It was not a good environment to be in, but I did it anyway because I loved all of the rest of you, and there was support still there. What I didn't realize was that his attitude that he was having towards me at those times, he was starting to exhibit towards Mom. Mm. And there was one day where I was working, and Mom came unexpectedly to my workplace, and she was crying, and she said that Dad was ignoring her. She said, I can't even put your engagement picture out. And I remember telling her, Mom, like, you're not a robot to be programmed. It's okay to have your own thoughts and feelings, which is ironic because I don't feel like I really was ever to exercise my own thoughts and feelings. But I definitely recognized that she was being influenced and controlled and manipulated by him in that situation, because he was desperately attempting to turn her to his way of thinking. And he was going to do that through whatever means necessary. And at that point in time, it was withdrawing love, and it was, I guess you could say, shunning. It was, the icy cold shoulder, which is something that, I feel like I saw modeled many times throughout our childhood.
Yeah. And, I don't want to jump ahead into stories or anything, but, something that, as we've gone through a lot of this stuff, to prepare to talk about it here, it's just striking how little things changed. Mm-hmm. Like how little tactics changed. Maybe they were tweaked or turned up a notch or two, but really not that much. Like what you're describing with Mom, in what year would that have been?
1996.
Yeah. What Mom was experiencing in 1996, she again experienced in 2020 and early 2021, which is just insane. It's like that span of time, it really didn't change. Because he didn't really change, not capable, I don't think. But it's just striking, like whatever works, why would you stick with it? Like don't fix what's not broken kind of mentality almost with that kind of stuff. If the manipulation tactic works, like stay at it.
Yeah, and I think he just kept turning up the volume a little bit on that. So part of her great sin was that she was supportive to me and she liked Kurt, and Dad was really the odd man out. He was really the only one. And he would say that he had nothing against Kurt. It's just that Kurt wasn't a godly man. Kurt wasn't the one for me. Like, he's making all of these judgment calls, and there's nothing glaring about Kurt's character. You know, there was nothing that he could point to. There was a point at which he was able to flip Mom, and that is still a question that I have. And I don't think I've ever spoken to Mom about this, and it's something that I would like to understand, because I mean, I think I can guess what happened. Dad was the type of person that would beat you over the head with something until you came around to his way of thinking, and maybe it wasn't, you know, completely genuine, but you kind of did what you had to do to survive. And I think that that's what she did, because that day that she came to see me at work, she was distraught. It was hard to see her that way. I could see then she was struggling. And this was before Dad had even given that message. So when I came back for the message and I saw the state that Mom was in, and I believe she was on the phone call as well when they told me I needed to come back, I knew something was very, very, very wrong. And that she was not okay. I've never, ever seen her like that. Or I had never seen her like that to that point. And it was really frightening. And I've wondered a lot, okay, what happened exactly? What happened between the last time I talked to her and this? But, you know, I wonder if it has something to do with cognitive dissonance theory, where you're a behavior and an emotion and a thought, and there is, you know, maybe your emotions and thoughts are not congruent with your behavior, or something is off balance with the three of those. And in order to kind of create balance, you have to decrease that dissonance. And so I may not be explaining this well. Do you know what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah, and I've wondered also if that pair, you know, what the mental beating and that paired with the maybe unspoken threat of what Dad was capable of doing.
Yeah.
Maybe those things kind of paired together were almost like a mental block where she couldn't allow herself to really think critically about how she really felt about that.
Right.
Because if you do, and you come to the conclusion that could mean that you might be separated from all of your children, or something worse, you know, like I can imagine that could have played a factor. I don't know if that's what you mean by
I think so.
the dissonance, but
yeah, just like she was having to behave in a way as if she wasn't in agreement, as if she was with Dad. So she was tampering down any kind of excitement she had about the wedding. She was not talking about seeing my dress to Dad. She said she couldn't even mention Kurt's name or talk about me. She couldn't put the picture out. So that behavior was not congruent with how she actually felt about it. And when you have that kind of contradiction, then that's going to create a lot of turmoil. And I think we naturally are going to seek a way to kind of reconcile all of that. That's kind of what I'm trying to say, that I think she just couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't walk a tightrope anymore. She had to choose. He was never going to let her have her own thoughts and feelings about this. That was never, ever going to be okay. It would be a choice between, you know, her family and being alone. I mean, and it wouldn't have just been that. I've thought about that a lot. I don't think that she could have withstood that at the time.
If she had even tried to attend your wedding,
Oh,
that
no.
even that alone, like I can see it in my head, like how that would have gone in the house.
Oh,
Like, and I feel like sometimes when we talk about this, it's hard to get across exactly what we mean, because you know we had it in the intro where it's like there's no true autonomy. It's not as if everything was this explicit. You can do this, you can't. There was this facade of you can do literally, and we've talked about this. Like I've heard it 100,000 million times in my life. Like you can do what you want, as if that should be a comfort to me. Like, oh, okay, I can do what I want. It doesn't mean that. It means you can do what you want, but if you go this direction, let me write you letters about what that means in detail, and like 45 scriptures at a time. It's just outrageous. Like, it's not real.
No,
it's just
absolutely.
all a farce.
And
like,
we all knew it wasn't real.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think that was also for outsiders, I think. Don't you?
How do you
I
mean?
think he liked to say when Kurt said,
yes.
you know,
Yeah.
what's her curfew? Well, she doesn't have a curfew.
I think it was for outsiders and also for himself.
Yeah. To make himself feel like he was not.
Because we knew that. Like,
Yeah.
and I think it probably goes back to like the cognitive dissonance even for us. Like I knew my whole life that wasn't true, that we could do what we wanted to do.
Absolutely not.
Like I remember, and again, I don't want to keep like jumping ahead to story, but, and we'll talk about this, but there was a point where, you know, dating was not allowed in our family. And I was a teenager, 15, 16, something like that. And there was a situation, not really a serious one. It was serious to him, not a serious situation as far as I'm concerned, looking back at it now, at all. But I remember him telling me, like, you can date, but like I knew exactly what that meant. Like you can date like the world does, but here is what that's going to mean. So really, like, can I date? No,
of course not.
You can date, and then you can be estranged from all of your family, and like maybe I live in the house and no one will speak to me, that type of stuff. It's like, okay, sure, that's great. Like, so is that a real choice? Like, no. So it's that kinds of mental manipulation for decades that you learn. Like it's all just a farce. Like you can't do what you want to do. You can't leave. You know, like Liz and I talked about, like after we left, the whole world literally opened up where it's like, oh, we can live somewhere else, which was insane, where it's like, we didn't even consider, like, I'm going to live in Russellville for the rest of my life because that's where the church is. And I'm always going to attend the church because that's the one I got to be in.
Right.
So it's that kind of thing. Like once we were out, it's like, oh yeah, we can live and work wherever we would like to as adult human beings. Like it's such a strange thing. And I think maybe people who didn't experience a high control group like that, that may be very foreign to them. But then people who are listening who did, like, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
100%. Yeah. I think we grew up with a stunted growth as far as our personal identities went.
Yeah.
We were not able to develop these authentic personal identities like normal, like children do in healthy families.
It's like those, what is that, Japanese foot binding technique where it's like, we're going to make your feet this way, is almost what it was like. We had to fit a very particular container of what we could and couldn't do and what we should be like, and what things maybe were identified that we might be good at, that we're glorifying to God in some kind of way. Like, that's what you're going to do, regardless of whether that's what you want to do.
No,
Like, that's who you're going to be. Like,
and Worldwide really set up that model with not only all of their teachings and some of the booklets, but especially the child rearing booklet, which is absolutely appalling. I think we've mentioned that before.
that's a Cult Next Door recommended read.
Oh, it's the plain truth about child rearing. I went back and read it because, and this was years ago, I found it online and I just wanted to understand. And it's just astounding to me that these men, and of course it's always these white men who love power and they've got all the answers. These are not child developmental psychologists. These are people who are deciding how you should treat an infant even, and without any regard to the science of cognitive development or just any developmental stage of a child and what they're capable of doing and understanding. And it is so antithetical to every bit of actual knowledge that we have on this topic now, and so damaging. Just, it hurts to read that. And I remember Dad saying years later, even, that book was their child rearing Bible, his. I mean, he doled out 99.9%, of the punishments. And it was, they were spankings. Dad would make such a show out of it with like getting the belt out, and you've got to stand there and talk about your sin and what you've done. And
do you remember the black bench?
The black bench?
Yeah.
No.
We had that bench that was in between Mom and Dad's bedroom and the bathroom. That little area there in the house.
Yeah.
There was a black wooden bench, and I remember every time I got in trouble and was gonna be spanked, it was like, go sit on the bench and wait until he was done doing whatever, and then.
Was that not the worst?
Oh,
I hated
it was worse
waiting.
than the spanking by far.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, and then we would get the talk about why we were getting the spanking. Yeah, so usually like the dad spankings weren't particularly painful or to me anyway.
Okay.
I don't know. You can.
I've got some stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mom's were.
Okay.
She uses that braided leather belt.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But that wasn't often. I'm not trying to shit on Mom. Mom's wonderful.
Mom's
Love
the
Mom.
best.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Dad literally beat the shit out of me once at the feast. Oh gosh, I should know every detail of this. I think it was Jekyll Island, and it was because I lied. It was just ridiculous thinking back on it now, but I was at the beach with a friend who will actually be on this podcast probably at some point. She was 4 years older than me, and I believe I was 12. Yeah. And no, I'm sorry. I was 11 years old. I was at this feast. She was babysitting me. We were also friends because our parents were very close friends in the church. And I told her, "You're not the boss of me." Like, who hasn't said that as a child? And I guess I was being difficult that day. So she told Dad that, I wouldn't listen to her. And Dad asked me if I said that. And I was not typically a kid who lied. That was just really pounded into our brains from a very early age, that is one of the worst things that you could do. And so I really tried not to ever lie. But in that moment, I knew what the consequence was. If I said I did it, I knew I was going to get an awful spanking. Because as I remember them, they were all mostly awful. I mean, that was just, for me, I thought they were painful. And I think it was also the humiliation and the shame and just all of it. And so I said no. He did not believe me, so I got spanked again anyway, or spanked anyway. And then he said he would come back up and ask me again. And I was spanked so many times. And by this time, I'm in too deep. I can't say, actually, yes, I said that. I have to hold to this lie, which it was an awful place to be in. I still remember how I felt in that moment. And he found out through someone else that I indeed did say that. And I was in this 2-story townhouse upstairs. I had been spanked so many times already. I'm sobbing. I hear him tearing up the stairs. And I knew, I don't know how, but he knows for sure now. And he grabbed me and threw me on the bed and was just hitting me with the belt. And I had bruises on my legs and thighs and stuff. And Mom was really upset. That was the only time I remember in my whole childhood where Mom was there and was trying to intercede and was asking him to please stop. She was crying. But he was out of control that day. And that's because I lied. And I was 11. And I remember at that moment, I thought, after he left me in there and I sat there crying, I vowed to never do anything so wrong again that it would warrant that. And so the rest of my childhood really was based around not making mistakes. And it already was to a degree, because mistakes were not something that were seen as benign in our house. Mm-hmm. Any kind of mistake. I definitely remember in elementary school walking in and seeing a welcome sign on the first day of school, and it said something about attitude. And Dad would just harp and harp and harp on our attitudes. And like, we were supposed to have a good attitude, which meant, you know, you don't look like you're not happy. You don't.
Not a punky.
Not
attitude.
A punky attitude.
Did you have a punky
Did
attitude?
you have a punky attitude?
Sometimes I did.
And I remember literally as this little child standing in front of that welcome sign going, they know about attitudes too. Like, I thought that was just our family. So now I have to have a good attitude at home and at school.
So essentially, if you exercised your autonomy, which we had the facade of in our household, even into adulthood also, there were repercussions. So when we were kids, it was spankings or being grounded, or in my case, at one point, shut away for 40 days alone type thing. There was always a price to pay, I guess is the point that I'm making. So if there's always a price to pay, a painful price to pay, then it's not, again, I feel like I'm a broken record, but it's just a facade. It's not real. If there's always something attached to it that's going to be painful for you.
And I also wanted to say that exercising autonomy was not safe. And we learned that so early on it was not safe in a variety of ways. There might be physical punishment, and there was also psychological punishment. There was a lot of shunning in our household and singling out of the person who made the transgression. And that transgression could be anything. It could just literally be, being seen as having a bad attitude that day. You're just having a mood. You're a human being that's maybe having a hard day. You're dealing with emotions, and that was not something that was ever embraced. And like you said about the Japanese shoes, I do believe we were definitely just put in molds. And that is what Worldwide grew. That was the culture in the church. And it was also like a badge of honor for the father of the family, who was the head of the house and the head of the wife and the children, to have well-behaved children. And so much of this was a reflection on Dad. And the better we behaved in services or in school or anywhere, the better it made him look.
The better we behaved, the better we performed. For sure, yeah.
Which you and I both, I mean, for me, piano, and for you, guitar and sound, and yeah. So speaking of autonomy in relation to Mom, she basically had to make a choice, which no mother should ever have to make. That was so cruel, that she was ever put in a position that she would have to choose between her daughter and everything else in her life. And, I wasn't there after I left. I didn't have a window really into what family life was like, and you were very little. But I have talked to some of the other older siblings about this and just kind of what things were like then. And, what I've learned is Mom was understandably losing weight. She was devastated. She was, I guess, at one point collapsed. I heard that was on my wedding day. All of that was completely unnecessary. None of that was necessary. All of this stemmed from one person's insatiable need for control and power. And he had been running that family like a cult, which is, what we've talked about, with him as like the supreme ruler of that cult. And we all knew what our parts were. And this was the first time, I was the first child. This was the first time anybody was ever doing something different than what he wanted. And I genuinely think he was shook, because I think he thought he had me in the bag. I think he thought he put enough time into me and enough, I hesitate to use the word grooming because I don't mean that in the way that, we typically use it. But he had conditioned me to follow him blindly. And I did. I believed him. I believed him when he said, I'm the best this, I'm the best that. I mean, because he did that a lot. He really elevated himself, whether it had to do with sports or his music or his speaking or his business, like everything. He was the best, right, at everything. And as a child, I thought, wow, my dad is like the best at everything. And so I did fall right in line. But when we had those conversations about scripture and about his interpretation, and I just really did not agree with his thoughts on those. And that was really, since I was little, was maybe the first time I was ever like presenting an opposing opinion. And I think from there, things just completely started to unravel for him. And like we spoke about in the last podcast, he just kept upping the ante to try to maintain that control. And when he realized the final thing happened, I got married, and he did this last ditch effort of disavowing the wedding vows, which, by the way, is in Numbers 13, I believe. Then it was necessary for him to just completely cut me off. I had no more use for him anymore.
And you were dangerous.
Well,
at that point.
that was how he posed it. And yes, in a sense, you could say I was a threat to his control, because the message would have been sent to all the rest of you. Hey, look, you can get married, and you can even move to a different town.
You can exercise autonomy for real.
Yeah.
And it'll be okay.
Yeah. Dad'll still love you.
Yeah.
But if that happened, then everything he's been building for all of these years would have crumbled. And I find that interesting that he said the house which I've built upon the sand would crumble and fall down upon me. And I think the real house he was worried about was his own. I think basically if he allowed me to still have a relationship with the family, his whole entire system of control would crumble, and everyone else would see the example and know that they too could make their own choices and decisions. Even if it wasn't in childhood, it was in adulthood, that there would be a time coming where you would be able to date someone and get married and not suffer, horrible consequences for that, even if he didn't like who you were choosing at that time. And the one thing, with the narcissist too, is that they have a very, very deep fear of being abandoned and being left alone. And so, that may have been part of his origin story in building this family cult, is I'm just going to hoard my children, and I'm going to make everyone into what I want them to be. And then they're never going to leave because I'm going to have the control. I feel like that is what happened with us. And I feel like that's what happened with Mom from a very, very early age. I mean, they got together when she was 16, married at 17. She had me at 19. And this all just happened really fast. And I'm sure she didn't have any other prior relationships to that you would consider, any real world experience. And so Dad was all she ever knew. And he was able to, through the Worldwide Church of God, make a case to her that I'm the head of the household. You're to be submissive to me. And once he was able to get her on board with this really strange church that he had found, once she believed it was the truth, then she was going to fall in line. And I think that's what she did. She fulfilled what she thought her role was. And that was to be his helpmeet. Had nothing to do with her. Everything revolved around him as the head of the house. And so for him, it was a great disrespect that she didn't push aside her own thoughts and feelings about me getting married and just stand with him. And again, yeah, no autonomy whatsoever. And, he would say that I have letters where he talked about he didn't, talk about this to mom because he knew that they didn't agree. Well, we both know what that meant. He ignored her. He treated her horribly. He let his disapproval be known every minute that he was in her presence. I mean, that is how it goes.
I remember mom and dad had their like high school yearbooks at the house.
Yeah.
And I would look through those because it was something fun to do when you're a kid. And you may remember reading this, like mom's, everybody writes in everybody's yearbook, and mom's note to dad in one of them was so like snarky. It was funny. She wasn't being mean, but a little bit mean. And it was very snarky, and like you saw so much like character coming through it. And it was, it was like a nice, soft, like backhand to dad about some stuff. It was funny. And I remember even reading that. It's been years since I have, but thinking like, I can't even imagine mom approaching anything like what she's writing here. Like, I don't even know who this person is. And so I think maybe what you were talking about worldwide, like a combination of maybe, dad's natural characteristics and paired with the, I don't want to say tactics, maybe that is the right word, that worldwide taught was just like the perfect pairing. Because I don't know what his mindset was before, if he was hardcore, like men are the head of the house. And obviously I wasn't around at that time to know. But I don't get that impression that he was back when they first got married. So just to kind of look from afar, at least what we can see foggy, back to that time, like the progression of what that must have been like for mom. Because, somebody who has MPD, which again, not going to diagnose somebody, I believe he does. They're always going to have certain characteristics that are going to come through no matter what. But to kind of see from afar what that must have been like for her to have it morph into a more of a spiritual abuse kind of situation where it's got the weight of God behind it. It's not just somebody that you're dealing with. It's got all of this. And then for the family to grow, like I think we wrote in our intro, like it only got worse as the family grew. And that's what I mean. Like it only got heavier and more difficult for everybody as the family grew in size and as we grew up in age. Like I feel like it just got harder as we went because so much more was tied to it. So I can only imagine like what that was like, that progression was like for mom. But
yeah, I mean, I wonder about that as well, because spirituality was always intertwined as far as my memory goes, and obviously yours. I don't remember the first 3 or 4 years before we came into Worldwide, but it became, even in Worldwide, the husband did represent God in the family, and the wife was to submit to the husband. I mean, there was even permission to spank wives. I don't know if you knew that.
Oh,
okay. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Just outrageous. And so mom was already experiencing that type of dynamic with him where he was the head, and that meant the interpretation of that is what I say goes. This is not a conversation. This is not, I want to hear what you think, and then here's what I think, and then I'll make the final decision. Because I know some husbands were doing that. Most were not, from what I remember. But dad, from as far as I can remember, he was the one that kind of ruled with an iron fist. There was no leeway. And also, again, like you said, we're not diagnosing anyone. If you look up the DSM and you look up what are character traits of narcissistic personality disorder, you will be able to check off pretty much every single one of them. And I that's to me not even a subjective thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like anybody looking in from the outside would be able to check those boxes.
And that's the same for me. And I always like to put the caveat of I'm not a doctor, I'm
Right.
not diagnosing. But as you and I both, like as people who have spent so much time with this person, like
Yeah.
I feel like I have a pretty good handle. I think you do too. So again, not diagnosing, but I think I know.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I've gone to therapy for years, and I've described things without ever using the term narcissism, and this is the thing that my therapist would bring up. Well, this is what this sounds like, you know? And so I think when Dad started his own group and really assumed that power and was relishing in that power, it just became even more of a demand of his for Mom to be lockstep with him. It was never going to be okay for her to exercise her human right to autonomy. She was never even aware that that was a right that innately she has. And so that for her, I think, and again, I don't want to speak for her, I think based on what I can see and understand, it looks to me as though she knew that she was going outside of this this system that had been created. And so in that sense, she probably did, I'm sure, she felt real guilt and real remorse. But like, who gave her the idea? Like, who conditioned her, you know, to believe that to have a different opinion from your spouse is somehow a sin against God? I mean, what?
Yeah, to have a disagreement on how to handle a situation with one of your children, not just be a sticking point in the house. That is not good, but more understandable. We're talking about, like, and I can't stress it enough. We're talking about like she's for a decade plus, like starting every morning with this prayer of asking God for forgiveness for the sin that she had committed. Like that was the environment that had been created. And at that point, and we talked about this a little bit, like at that point, the pendulum was swinging already and the momentum was going. It didn't need any more help. At some point, you didn't need any more reinforcement of that idea. Like it was going on its own momentum and own weight.
Yeah.
Which I think is an important thing about how these groups work. They don't really, a high control group, a leader can only do so much conditioning. Some of it has to be things that are set in motion that kind of carry on, that don't need babysitting.
Yeah.
Which I think is an important thing that we experience a lot. And that, what Mom was dealing with was certainly an example of it just going on its own for years.
Yeah, I can't imagine the mental turmoil and confusion and grief that she endured. And to know that, you know, the person who inflicted that is just watching it and agreeing with it. Yes, you did something absolutely horrible, and you should be repenting every day for that.
Yeah. And then the reinforcement for years after the fact to retell that story, which I don't think that was necessarily intentional. Intentional meaning like the purpose of having her retell the story to reinforce it. I don't think so, but that's what it does. When you have somebody retell the same thing over and over, it's like, yeah, it becomes rote at that point. It's not really even, it just kind of, it changes the whole thing, and becomes where it becomes part of your identity. And I think it did for her because she had to tell it 100 times. But
that makes me so angry. It really does. That's hard. That's really hard to think about that, because she didn't know, because of her conditioning, that was not normal.
mm-hmm.
That was not healthy. That's all she knew. Whew. So during that time when I was sending letters, and I spoke about that in the last podcast episode, that I came to a point where I just couldn't do it anymore. And I couldn't go see you and Michael anymore. It was devastating for everyone. And I didn't want to be responsible for setting off all kinds of, emotional pain in either of you. And it was definitely really difficult for me as well. I did write to Mom and Dad, and I wrote to Sarah because she was over 18 at that point. I don't believe I continued writing as many letters to Jennifer because she was younger, and I knew how that would be looked at by Mom and Dad. And I was just told flat out that I was not allowed to send you or Michael anything. So here's a letter. This was January 20th, 1999. And so I got married in 96. So he says, Ashley, the package you sent to Matthew at school through Mrs. Bewley is at Dennis's house. We have already told you we are not going to accept packages or letters to him through the mail or through someone other than you in person. We don't open your packages or read your letters, so why send them? Mom told you clearly that we didn't want any more letters. Don't send anything you don't want discarded. If there is a next time, we won't bother Dennis or anyone else to return whatever you had sent. If you want to come here and give Matthew something without involving others as some type of buffer between us and you, please do. Call first. We love you, Ashley, and we feel sad that years are being lost in your relationship with your family. But we know that until you come to understand the magnitude of the evil you have done, you will not allow God to create in you a clean heart and a broken and contrite spirit that would bring tears of repentance and humility. Your birth was not by mere chance. God knew you before you were born, and he determined to have your birth come through your father's loins, Hebrews 7:10, and through your mother's womb. Your father is still your father, your mother is still your mother, and you still stand outside his commandment to honor and obey your parents in the Lord. Ultimately, we believe God, and he will still believe in you, and we believe that there is coming a time when you will desire to honor and highly esteem the parents your heavenly Father gave to you, for it is pleasing in the sight of the Lord. In him, the Lassiter family. So
I was not consulted.
Yes, you were not consulted about the packages that were sent to you.
Or about the letter. I'm the Lassiter family. I was not consulted.
That's correct.
Speaking for me.
Yeah. But again, it had to be us, like us versus them mentality. Anything, me like not agreeing with him was opposing the whole family. And, I find it interesting that he'll say, "Oh, we love you, Ashley, and we feel sad." He'll say that, but then you have to understand the magnitude of the evil. And I know there have been questions for years. I mean, literally all of you have asked me, like, what is the great evil? What was it?
Was it so bad that it couldn't be spoken? Or was it so ridiculous that it couldn't be spoken? That was after we left, that was the question. Like,
yeah.
What are we talking about?
Yeah. So when Dad gave me the message, because this is just a little bit of clarification maybe, but when Dad gave me the message, all he knew was just that I was getting married and this was not what he wanted to happen. And, we've spoken extensively about that. After that point, in fact, I'm not sure if this happened right before I got married or after, but apparently the whole family had talks, and Sarah and Jennifer told him that I had confided in them things and asked them, don't tell Dad. Yeah, I did that.
As sisters and siblings do.
And we were close. And this just seems ridiculous. I'm just going to tell you this, even if this doesn't end up in here. Like, it seems so ridiculous to me now, because there was one person that I was very good friends with, someone of the opposite sex, that I never had a romantic relationship with. There were periods of time throughout the 2 to 3 years that I knew him that I had, that I crushed on him a little bit. But at the same time, I knew this was not somebody I actually wanted to date. And I don't even remember telling Sarah or Jennifer that, but apparently I said that at some point, that I thought he was cute, or I don't even know, literally no intention of ever dating him anyway. So that was brought up in letters by Dad, that I knew I liked him, and yet I continued to spend time with him. And it's so funny, because back then, when I was in the thick of all this, I really thought I had done something absolutely heinous, because I confided in Sarah and Jennifer. And there was, one other person I went on one date with, nothing happened. Another person, I didn't ever even go on a date with him, but I met him at college, and for a couple of weeks, we liked each other and stuff. But this is the magnitude of the evil. I mean, I was a virgin bride when I married Kurt. And you would have thought that I was just whoring myself out if you read these letters that he sent. And so it was really hard for me to have trusted him and believed him to be nearly infallible my whole life, and to hear him call me evil and talk about what I had done. I mean, there's one letter in here that's just like, "You're worthy of death," to weigh that with what actually happened. But the way that he presented that was a disrespect to your parents. Mm-hmm. You pulled your sisters into this deception and into your web of lies, as if just name anything I could have been doing that we would consider, really offensive now. And that was so difficult for me because I carried guilt over these things. I not over the actual things, but over talking to Sarah and Jennifer. I carried a lot of guilt because then I bought into that narrative that, I guess I must be horrible. I guess I really did an absolutely horrible thing, and I do have to repent of that. And I thought that I did need to repent of it. And the other thing, I told Dad that I knew I needed to repent and that I was running from God. And he would bring that up. You probably heard that growing up. And that was when, I told him that when he was giving me the message. And what I was talking about was the fact that I had literally slept in the same bed as Kurt, because he would have to get a hotel room or buy me a hotel room if I went there, and we decided we know where our boundaries are and we'll save money this way. And I had horrible guilt over that because I know that one of our siblings found out that I had slept at the same hotel room as Kurt, and it was Dad said I brought great shame upon her because she knew that. It's absurd. It's absurd. So there's that letter that he sent, and I have so many, and I saved them. And the reason I saved them, and I honestly, over the years, I have thought multiple times, I really should just burn all of these. Why am I hanging on to this? Maybe that would be a freeing process for me to just kind of let go. But the reason I kept them is because I always thought, if any of you came back to me and you wanted to know what happened, I needed to be able to show you. That way you wouldn't just be able to say, well, that is your rewritten history, or that's your perspective, and here's what Dad told us. I kept all of it. So over the first few years, I got letters from him. I got some that were just a whole, multiple pages of scriptures about basically how I deserve death and I'm a sinner. At the top of this letter, he said, Ashley, I put this together for someone else. They repented in tears. It's my hope you will benefit from it, Dad. And then he's highlighting all of these things. The first word that's highlighted is abomination.
Very subtle.
Yeah. A heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, spread strife. And wow. So the whole time I'm fighting myself because I'm finding my own voice for the first time ever in my life. And I know in me, I'm not that. I'm not wicked. I'm not evil. I don't want to hurt people. Yet this person that I had so much respect in and that I really looked to as just the foremost authority on everything, including every aspect of my life, is telling me I'm this. This was part of why I had no rest. There was a period of time where I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown, and I couldn't even tell you what I thought that was going to look like. I just felt like my mind couldn't take more. like something was going to happen. Like you can only bear so much before something just snaps. And I felt like I was in dangerous territory. Like I'm just not going to be okay. And that was just a really difficult time, this first few years. I would never want to go back to that. In this one letter, he says, "You have sinned against me personally, but have not come to me with confession and repentance. Don't deceive yourself. At judgment, it will be you and God alone. No one can stand with you." And then in this letter, he says, "You will not write to Michael or Matthew." In your letter to Matthew, you said, "I love you. I miss you." Well, if you do, then come and see him. There's nothing stopping you from coming here to visit, but you're not going to write him and express how much you love and miss him and never come see him. You seek to give the expression that I would not allow you to visit him or the other children, which is not true. It is true that I would not want you around at this time, but I am not standing in the way of you visiting on planned occasions. Now, Kurt is another matter. He would have to come at his own risk. I don't walk around feeling anger towards him, but sometimes I feel differently when I see someone in person. We would all prefer that you just forget about us and go on with your life. It upsets you to get letters from us, and we don't like your letters either. So it would be best to just go our separate ways, at least for a few years. Our family wants nothing from you except your repentance from sin and to honor your vow you made to God at your baptism. Without your repentance, there is no basis for a relationship. Any healthy relationship must be founded on basic truths of reasonable honesty and mutual interests. Since when does it work that way in a family? At present, we have no real mutual interest that will last beyond this age. You have charted your own course, which is not compatible with ours. So as long as you wish to continue on that course, please go in peace and leave your past behind. You stood in the way of the plan of God in the family. I trusted you and held you up to your sisters as a shining example of faithfulness. You never acted uncomfortable with that, even though you knew your sisters knew better. Just get on with your own life and let us get on with ours. And then he says at the bottom, remember this message. The house you have built on sand will fall down on you. In the dark, all alone, you will find great surprise and great fear. Whether you believe or not, this is the word I receive for you, and time will tell, won't it? Fast, pray, and seek your God before the first domino falls. I remember getting this letter and seeing this part at the bottom that says, remember this message, because it's bolded. And I was near having a panic attack. I saw that and I immediately covered that up. Like I just, the idea, the thought of listening to, like reading those words on paper was terrifying.
It's a really good snapshot of the psyche, I think, of a person like that.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of some of the double talk, one of the letters one of the first ones I think that you read a section from, where like I hear that you're giving people the impression that you're not allowed around, and then said the opposite in the same letter. Like, well, you aren't. Not right now. And it has to be scheduled, and not Kurt. And like all these qualifiers. But to say, like, don't be telling people that.
Right, exactly.
Which goes, again, back to what we talked about earlier. Like, you can do what you want. That type of thing. It's like, but that's not true. Like, you're telling people, I won't let you around. That's not true.
Right.
So here are all the conditions for how you can come around.
Right. Well, and also, and I didn't read this letter. I'm not sure it's in the stack. There are so many of them. But, he said, if he could get a hold of me right now, you know what he wouldn't do, and that don't think that I'm too old that my father can't take me to task. I mean, yeah, like, why would I put myself in that situation? Why would I go over there? That was not going to be a visit where we were going to enjoy each other's company. I mean, that was going to be a shit show. And I didn't know what kind of further psychological damage was going to take place. And I really cannot stress enough how really fragile I was mentally at that time. And I know Mom was as well, from what I've heard from the other siblings, which just breaks my heart.
And the years that immediately followed, and probably like you were reading one letter that was from 99, I think. And I don't know when they stopped being sent, but I know that during that time, the family cult dynamic, I can't imagine, and I haven't been in other people's shoes, I can't imagine it being stronger than what it became in the years after that. Because I know even, our sister, Sarah.
I know you realize we both do that because we were separated for so long. It's as if we're getting to know each other from the very beginning again. So I will say that all the time. My dad.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, it's your dad too.
Our dad.
Yeah.
Our sister, Sarah, she, we had talked about this in the previous episode, kind of took it upon herself to be like the standard bearer. Yeah. And I know she put like an immense amount of pressure on herself for that for so many years.
Yeah.
And then I know Michael, as the eldest boy, the same thing.
Yeah.
And just we kind of became this incredibly tight unit, especially us kids. And I think that's probably twofold. Probably because we didn't have anybody else because we're in the cult system.
Yeah.
But kind of, I think it goes back to what Dad said to you in one of those letters, like what happened with you, like not letting it happen with them. So much focus was turned towards like, well, we can't control what's going on out here or with Ashley, so we're just gonna kind of cocoon ourselves, which was protective. At least on the surface, it looked like it was a protection kind of thing for us. But just the isolation that occurred in the years that followed. Like, again, I haven't been in other people's shoes. I'm sure that there are circumstances that were extreme for people, but I can't imagine it being more of a family cult dynamic than what was happening in the years that followed.
No, and I didn't really know what was happening exactly, but I knew it couldn't be good. Because there was a period of time where I still thought there's going to be reconciliation. And yes, it may be super uncomfortable, but this is going to happen. And surely I'm not this can't be real. I'm not going to be separated from my family forever. Dad is going to have to come around somehow. Although I really didn't know how that was going to happen. But when I realized, oh no, there's no going back. He does not need me anymore. Mm-hmm. I am a threat to what he's trying to do over there. I really feared the worst for all of you. And at that time, I feared the worst for Sarah and then Jennifer, because Sarah had just turned 18 and Jennifer, was close behind her. And I just thought about these as the years went on, these developmental things that they could be doing that they probably weren't. And that was really hard to know that they were just fully in it. And, obviously I missed and worried about you and Michael as well. I think my focus was on the later teen years and how that was going to be, how you all would transition into adulthood, because it definitely didn't go well for me.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't realize how bad that, things were for you and for Michael, like as really young children. And that's pretty devastating to know, that all that was going on.
And it's painful for me looking back, the way that we, in the immediate aftermath, the immediate few years, like the way that we rallied around Dad, in just generally speaking, and then also the way we kind of rallied in terms of adopting a negative isn't even the right word, but I'll use a negative view of you.
Yeah.
I think I just speaking for myself, like, I think Mom and Dad didn't really talk about you, first off. But I think I probably talked more harshly about you than they did, which is crazy and makes me sad and angry. Because again, I was like 7 years old.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know. Like, how could I possibly have a ground to stand on to be like, Ashley's bad, but that's what happened. And so I look back at that and it's like, man, we really just rallied around Dad and everything that all the information he was pumping out, which I think goes directly back to Dr. Hassan's BITE model, where you go to thought control, where it's the binary us versus them. You were them, you were other. So there was no in between. It was very black and white. There's no gray. There's no understanding what may have happened, or disagreements, or gray area between what Dad says and what you said. Like, what Dad said was what happened. And we didn't even know exactly what that was, but him being mad enough at you to cut you out, we didn't need to know anymore. As far as I was concerned, like, he must be right about it, whatever it is. So I don't need to know more.
Right. So, which meant like real loss of everyone. And you talked about the BITE model, which I hope we do get into more depth later on, but you didn't have the information because he was controlling the information, which is the I in BITE. You only had this one version, and also he gave the family language to use around what had happened. And that language was of a catastrophic nature. And so everyone's operating under this assumption that what we're talking about is evil, and that it's corrupt and it's dangerous, and we have to separate ourselves from her because we are all at risk and we are under threat. And I think language is so important. And he weaponized that language. And even for me, hearing that language, I feel like that was weaponized against me as well, to just kind of bombard me with letters that were condemning me one after another and telling me that I'm horrible and that I'm evil and that I deserve death and all of these things. It really messed with my mind, because so much of your sense of self comes from your parents. And if he had been a healthy father, He would have helped us grow into our own individual, authentic selves that would have all been different from one another. But instead, we were not allowed that.